financing institution, CDB must also contend with the credit rating agencies. They are now cognizant of the inherent risks associated with climate change and natural hazards, and factor their projected impact, that is the impact of the natural hazards, on the fiscal and debt sustainability. They factor these into the country's credit rating. This in turn can adversely impact the credit quality of CDB's portfolio and therefore our cost of raising funds in the market. It's a toxic brew. Given these circumstances, we need to build partnerships with institutions which have access to soft resources for climate-related investments. Ladies and gentlemen, CDB remains committed to leveraging its partnerships, innovate, and to aggressively secure more concessional and grant resources, as well as technical and capacity building support to achieve lasting development results for BMCs. Over the last 2 years, we raised some $200 million to support both adaptation and mitigation investments. We also provided over $10 million in grant financing to support the work of regional institutions, like the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and the University of the West Indies, as well as national institutions. In this way, we have provided the technical support necessary to encourage decision makers to integrate climate and disaster risk considerations into their planning and investment programming. The research work produced by Professor Taylor and his colleagues provides a solid scientific evidence base for strong global transformative climate action. For Caribbean countries bearing the brunt of climate change, pursuing 1.5 degrees as a target is more than worth it. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Dr. Warren has set the tone of why this session is so important, and therefore I'm extremely pleased that it was not with any special effort that they committed the funds to support the research. At this time, I would like to announce the arrival of Prime Minister Chasney from St. Lucia. And sir, your timing is right, sir. You need to come straight to the podium. I would like to once again introduce the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, who is responsible for environmental issues and climate change in the Caribbean community. So with that, sir, I'd like to introduce you to give a few remarks on this session. Thank you.
Thank you very well, and thank you for helping me with my timing. Honorable delegates at the head table, Prime Minister, the Honorable Keith Mitchell, Warren Smith, the President of CDB, my other colleagues. I'm going to take a very different approach today because, unfortunately, I'm often quoted now to say that time has run out on us on this issue. And I want to really separate the OECS, CARICOM, and more importantly the SIDS around the world, who have been patiently waiting for the world to get its act together. And I think that this summer was a very strong reminder that the time has run out on us. And I really want to quote Roosevelt Skerritt, the Prime Minister from Dominica, in his UN address, in which he likened what took place as a war. And unfortunately, it's a war that we didn't start, and it's a war that we can't end. And so we're on the front of this battle line. So I want to say to you that the SID countries have been advocating for years for more assistance to build a more resilient infrastructure to protect our economies. And in that I mean that we continuously come to these events and there's mitigation and adaptation. And even in the agreement in Paris, only 20% of the funds were set aside for adaptation. And since the advent of Irma and Maria this summer, the need is now more critical than ever. And not only for the affected countries, but also for the ones that know it's only a matter of time before it's going to be our turn. There are 4 critical constraints that we've identified to solving this problem, meaning getting funds to help us in building resilience. So the first one was that the OECD and the ODA have been using per capita GDP, one single measurement to classify countries. And in that classification, all or most of the SIDS are either middle income or high-level income countries. And the result of it have not had any access to the concessionary funds. The other one has been that access to sufficient funds. So again, when we continuously hear about monies being available, and we're all incredibly grateful for anything that we get, but the funds are grossly inadequate for the size of the problem that we have to face. The next one is the over-bureaucratic and time-consuming process to draw down funds. And it's something that we have to be able to address moving forward. And the last one is the impact of resilience building on our macroeconomic indicators, such as our debt to GDP. So we're saying that we have to think of a new way of how we're going to classify resilience building in terms from a loan perspective. I like to think that right now, to put us in the frame of mind that any prime minister in our region is right now, is to say that time is against us. Time is against us in that the opportunity cost that's being lost. So for instance, in my region, Dominica, St. Martin, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico are still struggling to recover. In fact, I think it's only 60%, only 40% of the people in Puerto Rico actually have electricity how many months later. And the same thing can be said for the French St. Martin, for the US territories, and for Dominica. And the opportunity cost that's being lost is that many of my nationals and nationals from Grenada and other countries actually were living in those islands and sending remittances back home. Many of the islands in the south were providing agricultural produce to those countries up north. And then the other one is that Puerto Rico, for instance, is the home port for the cruise industry. And because Puerto Rico is in the state it is in, because the other islands near Puerto Rico also have been dramatically damaged, it's impacting the viability of that industry. So the monies that are being lost every single day, we could never recover that money. That's money that has just been lost and those opportunities are gone. Migration. So right now we're seeing on many of the islands, people are migrating. And the people that are migrating are the people that can afford to leave. And that tends to be your middle class and your upper class. And in small developing states, this is the backbone to your economy. These are the people who are the leaders in your community, your mother and father's groups, coaches in your teams, people who are sitting on your boards. And when those people leave, it's going to take a long time to convince them to be able to come back. And then the last one, which is the scariest one, is that in 9 months' time, the next hurricane season begins. And there is no message that we can send to anybody to say, please put a hold on the hurricane season coming, we're not ready, and wait for us to get our act together. So this is the reason that we need to take action now. And so the question becomes, what action in my mind is required? So first of all, I want to thank the UN General Secretary, and I also particularly want to thank the UK government that 2 weeks ago at the OECD meeting got the OECD to agree and to the ODA to agree that SID countries now would be treated differently, and that a new classification would be entered into, which would allow SID countries now to be able to have access to funding at a concessional rate. So, I mean, I think that's a huge stride that was made. And the reason why the UK government was so vested in this is that they fell into a problem in that the Anguilla and BVI, which are their territories, they were not allowed to send ODA funds to them because they were both middle income countries. But for whatever the reason is, I'm very, very grateful that the OECD has made that first step. There's a meeting this week with the IMF in Jamaica, which is a critical meeting. We're here at COP. There is a UN CARICOM emergency meeting for funding for the region, which has been set for New York, if I'm not mistaken, the 22nd and 23rd of November. And then the World Bank has also agreed to have a meeting in Paris in early December. So the critical issues that still need to be determined. First of all, is a dedicated source of funds to support resilience building. We need a firm commitment from the development countries for funds to be allocated for resilience and specifically for the SIDS. And maybe to provide some incentive to developed countries. Many of them are struggling to meet their 0.7% goal for ODA funds. Maybe for the case of SIDS, we can allow the contributing countries to get a quota of maybe 2 to 1 for every dollar that they're putting in towards meeting that 0.7% goal. We're currently preparing a white paper to develop what we're calling a resilience bond, and that would be a special purpose vehicle to attract private sector funds to be able to come in. And so the question becomes, what are the concessions that we have to be able to provide to allow the private sector to bring their funds to the table? And we're hoping that if we can get everybody to agree to this, and that the SIDS are the first line in benefiting from this, if it's successful, this is something that can be rolled out on a larger basis. We need to agree on new protocol to simplify the drawdown of funds allocated for resilience building. So what do we mean by that? If you take the OECS countries as an example, and CDB is generally where most of the funds are able to come in, most developing agencies and also individual countries have their own criteria for implementing funds. I think it's time where we can get them to harmonize on one process. By agreeing on that one process, it means now that we can prepare projects while we're waiting to identify funds. Whereas right now, we're literally having to rewrite project proposals on the basis of who we're going to get the monies from, which now is increasing the length to be able to get access to the funds. If in fact, and it probably is the case, that many of us do not have the necessary resources in project proposals, I think that there is a need to put together one team to assist us in identifying those projects and preparing those projects to become shovel ready. And then the other thing is time is against us. We can't sit here and accept that it takes 2 and 3 years or 4 years to be able to draw down on funds. It must happen quicker. And I liken it to when I go to a country that's been affected by a disaster, all of a sudden people are moving much faster to get things done. So let's not wait for the hurricane to create a sense of urgency. Why don't we have that urgency now in order that we can resolve our problems? In terms of the IMF, I think that the ask of the IMF is that we need to figure out how we're going to classify the funds that we're borrowing. So the number one challenge facing us small countries is the amount of fiscal space that we have. So we have high debt, we have very little cash, and many of us are running deficit governance. So if in fact now there's an urgent need to spend this money for resilience building, and the money that you're going to spend is not adding any capacity. So what do I mean by that? If we have to raise the height of a bridge, but it only is going to carry the same number of vehicles it was carrying before. So it means it's an expenditure to build for resilience, but it's not adding any capacity. When I have to take all my utilities and put them underground, there is no capacity change. All I'm building is resilience. If I have to do slope stabilization, or I have to strengthen my rivers, all these are things that are absolutely necessary to protect my asset base, but they're not going to contribute significantly to my GDP growth. So given the circumstances we're in, if we are now to borrow monies for resilience building, even at concessionary rates, if we have to treat it as debt in the traditional way, we can't do it. So should this debt now be considered an off-balance sheet item? Or Do we agree that we're going to amortize resilience building over a longer period of time? The last piece I want to say, in closing up, is sometimes we overcomplicate what resilience building is. So resilience building is slope stabilization. It is river stabilization. Strengthening our rivers, broadening the shoulders so that if we have heavier rains, it can be carried out. Raising the bridges, putting larger drains in place, putting our utilities underground and strengthening the existing roads and the essential service buildings. We no longer can use schools as our shelters because after the hurricane, the schools need to go back into operation, but people's homes are still damaged and there's a conflict in that area. And then we need regional support. The SEDIMAs of the world need to get strengthened. I mean, the need for them to have their own equipment in the period of time, helicopters, boats, and planes, because we were completely dependent on everybody else's benevolence. And the hurricanes wiped out the northern part of the island, of the countries, Puerto Rico and the United States, where we would have traditionally gotten our support. So I just want to say that I'm here, and I'm going to continue championing the fact that we need assistance now. I'm hoping a decision that can come out of COP is to agree to allow the SIDS to be classified separately, and that we agree that we can implement a plan to resolve these issues, these what I call impediments to the ability for us to build resilience and to deal with the climate change issues. I thank you very much.
My brothers and sisters all, it is a well-known fact that small island developing states in the Caribbean and elsewhere are already reeling from the brunt of the impacts of climate change, despite making minimal contributions to the climate change problem. The science of climate change is clear to us. The unprecedented extreme weather events as a consequence of climate change that occurred recently, from which many of our peoples are still suffering, are foremost in our minds. We are now charged to prepare ourselves for more frequent and more severe events like these in the future. It is not if, it is simply when. The geophysical evidence of climate change is here for all of us to see, despite the skeptics, and you know there's some important skeptics around. The macroeconomic, social, and psychosocial disruptions to our people, our economies and countries are already visible. This is uncontestable. It is clear that there are substantial and exponential increases in risk and impacts from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. Our refrain has always been 1.5 to stay alive, but 1.5 degrees still possesses serious adaptation challenges for us. Even at the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, adaptation is not enough. Hence our call for a more robust and comprehensive regime on loss and damage. We are also clear that there are feasible pathways to get the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limits. This requires the will, the commitment, and the urgent actions of the global community to get to this low carbon development pathway to guarantee our survival. We are fully aware that the IPCC report will establish further scientific evidence on the impacts of 1.5 degrees. We must, however, act now to build a national and regional resilience regime to be able to cope with these impacts. We look forward to forging greater partnership in this effort. And in this regard, I want to thank the CARICOM Secretariat, the Climate Change Center, and the Caribbean Development Bank for the resolve to address this matter and for staging this event. I see this as an important period, and that's why, sisters and brothers, despite my heavy schedule with important activities and with Santa Claus very soon to come, I am here today because of the very important aspects of this meeting. And thank you. Chairman, I hope I satisfy your objective.
At this time, I would also like to invite to the high table Dr. Abel Centea from Cuba. He is one of the lead modelers we have in the Caribbean. And between Dr. Santerre and his group, along with Professor Taylor, they were able to come up with the implications of 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees. So I'd like to recognize both of them and ask Dr. Taylor, your time now has been cut, Dr. Taylor, so you have to bring it down, but get the message across. It's because we have a limitation in the room. So you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leslie, and I acknowledge all the distinguished people at the head table. And friends and colleagues, good afternoon. I am really grateful for the honor and the privilege to talk to you a little bit about what we call the Caribbean 1.5 project. This for us is a signature project within the Caribbean region, not the least of which is because, of course, we have a number of partners funding it, but also because of what it represents. If I could tell you in 2 words what I think the Caribbean 1.5 project is, it would be these 2 words: 1.5 matters. This project is everything about matters dealing with 1.5, as well as trying to establish that 1.5 matters. In the 15 minutes that I now have, what I want to do is quickly set a context. I want to tell you about a little bit about how the Caribbean 1.5 project is structured. I don't have the time to explain all the detailed results that come out of it. I want to draw your attention to what I think are 3 emerging considerations from the science. And that's all I will try to do. And I will in fact then just take some illustrative results from the project just to make these 3 emerging considerations. And then from these 3 considerations, what I would like to do then is offer a conclusion. This project is about 1.5 matters. Let's take the context. What do we know about this Caribbean 1.5 project? The Caribbean 1.5 project is a regional climate change impacts project. It is very much a science initiative. It has as its base science questions. What does the Caribbean look like when the global mean temperatures are 1.5 to 2.5? What are some of the impacts that will be in the Caribbean at these global warming targets? And certainly investigating a little bit about timing for these things. It is very much a collaborative initiative. So it's 45 regional scientists coming together from 11 regional institutes. The scientists span both the natural and the social sciences, and 6 centers. It is truly a collaborative initiative. It is also a validation initiative. We have heard a lot of statements about what 1.5 means for the Caribbean. We are trying to validate that 1.5 is in fact a reasonable global target for the Caribbean to put forward. And then I would add that it's a bold initiative. It's also the Caribbean scientists trying to make an impact on the IPCC process by putting Caribbean science in the IPCC literature. The 1.5 project is structured in kind of 2 ways. In the first, we want to establish the future climate profile of the Caribbean. And we do this using, of course, the models, the global climate models and the regional climate models. And we do a little bit of what the process called time sampling. So very literally, we are sampling the profile of the Caribbean, the climate of the Caribbean, when the world is at these particular global warming targets. And so we use time sampling and we use models and we try to come up with what the profile of the Caribbean climate will look like. If we have that profile of the Caribbean climate, then we take that profile and we look on some key sectors in the Caribbean which are impacted by the climate. We use a case study approach. So we look on energy in Suriname, we look on agriculture in Cuba and Jamaica, we look on water in Barbados, and you can see the others there. This part of the project is still ongoing. So whereas the first part is in a greater stage of completion, the case study part of the project is still in progress. But this is the kind of 2-step approach that we are taking. Where are we in the project? In terms of it, we have the climate data. Some of it's been acquired, some of it has been generated for ourselves. We are looking on the impact, so I say that's a stage that's in progress. So we're linking the climate models to the impact models, we're looking on those case studies. Certainly, we're trying to produce a peer-reviewed papers. We have 6 already in various stages of peer review. And then, particularly important for this presentation, we're trying to look at what are the emerging considerations that are coming out. So when we take the bulk of the results, are there some emerging considerations about 1.5 that are important for the region and certainly for the globe? I want to leave you with 3 of these emerging considerations, bearing in mind the time that I have left. Very quickly. The first kind of thing that's emerging as consideration, certainly for the Caribbean region, and certainly what I think the Caribbean science is putting on the table, is this. 1.5 is a matter of necessity. And that's the kind of picture that the science of the Caribbean is putting out there. So one of the approaches that we have taken is to look on a 2 degree Caribbean profile versus a 1.5 degree Caribbean profile, and to produce diagrams that look something like this. This is an illustrative diagram. The one you're looking on is a change in mean annual rainfall if we take the 2 degree climate and we minus the 1.5 degree climate. And in the diagram, the shades of brown, the more intense they are, the drier the region becomes, and the blue is, of course, the wetter. You can begin to see that a pretty harsh picture emerges. Across the Caribbean, significant drying across the Caribbean, with more intense drying over the Central American Caribbean coastline and the Southeastern Caribbean. And it gets worse as you go to 2.5 and higher degrees. You can see that, in fact, well, one of the things we want to point out is the fact that this drying that occurs at 2 is in fact a reversal of conditions that occur at 1.5, and that becomes significant, and I'll pick it up back just in a little while. The percentage of when we're most drier is certainly between May and August, and in the Caribbean we know that's a problem. That's when we get rain. And certainly if we look at other precipitation kind of indices, fewer days with intense rainfall and more periods of moderate drought. But you get the idea that at 2, we have a harsh Caribbean climate ahead of us. If we look on temperature indices, the picture does not get any better. So I'm looking on the change in the number of warm spells in the Caribbean, and that little inset with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are for those countries, and it tells you how many more really, really warm days we will have at 2 than you will have at 1.5. And the picture is clearly a significant portion of the year is going to be excessively warm in the Caribbean. Between 70 and 100 more warm days at 2 than at 1.5. And the largest warming again is over Central America, Northern South America, the Greater Antilles. And there are regions in the domain that, even though it's a 0.5 degree change in the global mean temperature, will be warmer than the globe. I think you get the point that I'm trying to make. I'm trying to make the point this. At 2 degrees, we have a significantly harsher climate. So the higher the warming target is, the harsher the climate becomes in the Caribbean. And particularly, if you look at the combination of conditions, this is particularly troubling. So the temperatures increasing, the rainfall decreasing, the warm spells increasing, the intense rainfall days going down, the hot and dry days increasing, and the drought increasing. This kind of combination suggests that the Caribbean will be moving into the realm of the unprecedented. We have not seen that kind of combination of harsh conditions. And then, just to give you an idea of the impacts reports, where they are going, so you'll note that as we begin to look on the impacts, we see that hydropower in Suriname will decrease, agricultural productivity in Jamaica goes down, the cost of damages in the region are going up, the mortality of the coral reefs, the more of them are dying, and certainly the water in Barbados, which is already water scarce, is going down. What does the first message that's emerging? 1.5 is a matter of necessity. Any higher alternative to 1.5 seems to put the region in the realm of the unprecedented. And as we have heard already in some of the speeches, when we're in the region of the unprecedented climates, the challenges also become unprecedented for us. Very quickly, what's the second consideration? If the first consideration from the science is that 1.5 is a matter of necessity, then the second one is actually that 1.5 is a matter of compromise. The second type of work that we're trying to do is put a picture of 1.5. Now, this is not a picture of 1.5 in comparison to 2. This is the picture of 1.5. I start with the same kind of temperature diagrams, because you will note that the temperature diagram looks similar, maybe a little slightly lighter color of yellow, but it looks very similar. And the point I think we're trying to make here is that even at 1.5, the temperature extremes that the Caribbean will see will be problematic. So at least a third of the year is going to be warm. It might not be 2/3, but a third of the year will be extremely warm. Again, we note the regions of largest warming and moderate increases up to 15 days in really hot and dry days for most of the region, but it's less in comparison to 2, we agree. If you look on the rainfall picture, it looks slightly different. In fact, at 1.5 degrees, we tend to be mostly wetter in the mean. So anywhere between 5 and 25% wetter, especially if you go into that southwestern corner. And this actually poses an interesting problem, because if the sign switches between 1.5 and 2, the question is, what do you adapt to? Do you adapt to the more intense rains at 1.5, or do you adapt to the dry conditions at 2? So it poses, we think, a very interesting problem. And the domain, of course, experiences moderate to severe drought about 17% of the time, but this is a little better than the higher percentages at 2 and 2.5 degrees. We try to sum it up in this kind of diagram. And the arrows, the direction of the arrows indicate the way it's increasing or decreasing. The size and intensity of shading represents the change in magnitude and intensity. I think the point we're trying to make is this. If you look at the 1.5 level and the 2, especially for temperatures, there is a problem still, even at 1.5. Certainly, and even with the rainfall, it poses this kind of dilemma that I have put forward. So 1.5 is not without its challenges, particularly with respect to temperature extremes. And some of the changes at 1.5 may be at the bounds of the unfamiliar, of the familiar, the extremes that we know of today. So in other words, we are bordering on the edge of familiar. We may have seen it occasionally, but certainly not too frequently. It seems to represent for the region a risky climate, 1.5, just less risky than 2. What am I trying to say? The second kind of message that's emerging from the science is 1.5 is a matter of compromise for us in the Caribbean. Going for 1.5 is a concession that we are making for the region to move to the realm of the unfamiliar, but betting that the unfamiliar may be a little bit better than the unprecedented that will be at 2. Last message, I think I'm almost out of time. So we think this is what the science is suggesting. It's certainly a matter of necessity. We think it's certainly suggesting that it's a matter of compromise. And the last one, and I think I pick up right where Prime Minister Chastanet left off, it's a matter for action. One of the things we did was we chose the RCP 4.5 pathway for the world. So that puts the world at somewhere around 2.5 if you follow the CMIP 5 models by the end of the century. And we said, okay, suppose this is the pathway that the world is on to 2.5 degrees. When would we see, using the models, the 1.5 unfamiliar world? When would we see 2 degrees, the unprecedented world in the Caribbean? Well, 1.5, it turns out, comes in somewhere in the 2020s. That's late 2020s, that's 10 years away for the onset of the unfamiliar, the moving into the realm of the unfamiliar. The 2 degree comes in the 2050s. That's not too far away for the onset of the unprecedented. And certainly 2.5 comes in at much later. The science is suggesting, and especially when we look at the impact report, that, boy, it clearly, any way you want to take these results, it requires action. Because certainly, one set of action you may argue is that it certainly needs significant global mitigation to push that 1.5 to the end of the century at least, to allow the Caribbean a little bit more time to prepare for the unfamiliar. If you don't like that route, then certainly it requires significant facilities to enable the Caribbean to adapt to an earlier onset of the unfamiliar and an earlier onset of the unprecedented. However you want to take it, we are suggesting that it requires action from the science, and action now. So another way to say it, the science is suggesting that the third consideration is simply it's a matter for action. Going for 1.5 puts the region and the entire world squarely in the realm of urgency. And that's the thing. because the window of opportunity for achieving 1.5 or even being prepared for it is fast closing or maybe closed already. So I hope I'm doing well with my time. Let's make a conclusion. So the Caribbean 1.5 project, significant for us in the region. It's the region doing its own science to validate its own case. The science seems to be suggesting, this project is ongoing, but pulling out some suggestions from it, that when it comes to 1.5, it's a matter of necessity, absolutely. Otherwise, anything else pushes us into the realm of the unprecedented. It's saying it's a matter of compromise, because in truth, 1.5 is a risky climate for us. And so we are really conceding to moving into the realm of the unfamiliar as opposed to the realm of the unprecedented. And it's a matter for action, because it says, the science says, we are right there, right now, in the realm for urgency. If it's a matter for necessity and a matter for compromise and a matter for action, I think we can conclude that 1.5 matters. Thank you very much.
I would like to take this opportunity of apologizing to the earlier speakers for pushing for this time, because I felt the message that Professor Taylor was going to present to us was so important. And it fits right in with what the Prime Minister from St. Lucia said, the urgency, we have to act. And I would like to point out also that in the Caribbean, the temperature at this present time has already risen over 1 degree. So we don't have much space to that 0.5. And therefore, I would like to thank Dr. Taylor, Dr. Santerre, and their teams for doing this research under pressure, because we advised them we have to have some results to get into the IPCC as peer-reviewed research, because we must have an impact on the next IPCC report, and they have done it. So I'd like you to join me once again to thank Professor Taylor and Dr. Santerre and their team for the work. I will be guided by my team to tell me when we have to vacate. Officially, we're supposed to be vacating at
2 o'clock.
At 2 o'clock. But I will still persist with some questions until I get the signal that we must leave. So if there are any questions, we would like to take a few in terms of the work done by Professor Taylor and the team from INSMET in Cuba. I have a hand over here and a hand up. Do we have any microphones that we can use? Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. It's quite a harrowing predictions. I'm just wondering what the modelling and the science says about the prevalence of future hurricanes and tropical storms in the Caribbean if we do end up going down the 2-degree pathway, if the region is much drier.
This is on, right? Okay. Right. Well, just to begin by saying, though we haven't looked on those things particularly in this project, because we were trying to create the other kind of climate profile, if I rely on the IPCC science, certainly, the IPCC doesn't necessarily suggest that we may get more, but certainly what we get, you know, the rainfall rates will be warmer, the wind speed will be greater, the kind of rapid intensification, especially like what we have seen this particular summer. So it doesn't present a pretty picture in terms, and the other, you know, climate signals support that. So we have a warming sea surface temperature, and we see that in the Caribbean region. So generally, it fits in right with this in terms of the harsher kind of environment that we are coming into as we move from 1.5 to 2 and even higher degree warming. Yep.
Any other question? Over. Dr. Singh?
very much, Dr. Leslie, and thank you, Professor Taylor, for your presentation. One of the observations you made at 2 versus 1.5 is the intensity of rainfall will drop. And that seems, somewhat contrary to your natural intuition. And one of the issues that we have nowadays, certainly with Irwin and Maria, was the level of rainfall, very heavy rainfall leading to mass destruction. Would you comment on that a bit in terms of why that seems to be reversed? Certainly we know it's going to be drier, but it gives the impression that the impact, for example, of hurricanes will be less.
Sure, no problem. Actually, I think I need to qualify that. What we looked at were the number of days with intense rainfall, and that's what falls. So it doesn't mean that the rainfall will necessarily be less intense. It just means that we're going to have these longer dry periods, certainly because the consecutive dry days also increase. And then when the rain falls, it could very well be more intense. In fact, if we use the kind of signals we see now, that is in fact the case. So it wasn't really the intensity of the rainfall, it was really the number of days within. If I communicated otherwise, I apologize. Certainly, we also are trying to draw a little bit of a distinction between 1.5 and 2. Because actually, at 1.5, the number of days with intense rainfall increases. But when you go to 2, it switches sign, and the number of days with intense rainfall decreases. That poses, each has its own significant kind of challenges. And we think that that poses a challenge for where do you put your adaptation strategies towards. It's where you feel the world will end up, but you could very well end up with maladaptation, if you don't hedge correctly. So I hope I've explained that.
Okay, I saw there was one final question we can take, because we are now cutting into the time of the other session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, distinguished Prime Ministers, good afternoon, delegations. I want to thank the Caribbean scientific community and its leadership for the research, both for us as a region as well as for the impact on the world. And my question, therefore, is based on your conclusion, and it's more of a policy rather than a scientific question. Perhaps the question then is directed to the Prime Ministers on the panel. And that is, if you conclude, and we agree with you, that 1.5 matters to the extent implied that we ought not to go beyond it as much as is possible, then I'd like to ask the Prime Ministers on the panel, what initiatives can you propose for the other SIDS as well as the rest of the world in the context of not going beyond 1.5? What sorts of campaign or efforts within the Paris Agreement might the Caribbean community propose to respond to this emerging and almost already conclusive science? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it goes back to what Prime Minister Scared said, that we're in a war that we didn't start and we don't have the capacity to end. In other words, that there's nothing that we can do in changing our own habits that's going to reduce the increase in climate warming. So that's why the need for adaptation is so critical. So when I go to Dominica and I see the level of the catastrophe or in the BVI or in Anguilla, I see my fate. And so what are the things that we can learn from what has happened recently, and what can we do to prepare ourselves better for what it is? So for instance, the rainforest. There is no prevention for what took place with the rainforest in Dominica. And after the hurricane, there's no grocery store or shop that you can go to and buy a rainforest. It requires time to be able to get that resolved. But there are things that we can do to minimize the overall level of impact to allow us to be able to get back on our feet quicker. And those are the things I highlighted. Slope stabilization, fix up your rivers, put your utilities on the ground. In the case of Dominica, one of the things that did work was the fact that the telephone system of Flow was underground, an optic fiber. And so Flow was up and running much quicker than everything else. So there are some very clear lessons. And that is why we as leaders in the region, along with the SIDS, are asking the world to allow the SIDS to be treated differently. We don't have the ability of waiting any longer. And unfortunately, the reduction in global temperatures requires a much bigger global action plan that's beyond us. We can sit here and talk about it, but it's going to require the activation of the rest of the world to be able to make those things happen. But in the meanwhile, you were just saying 2020 for 1.5, right? So it means that we have less than 5 years to get ready for 1.5, which is pretty catastrophic for in itself. So what you've seen this summer is something that's going to be a recurring theme, and we need to get ready. And that's why, I'm going to work with my good friend Warren and CDB and the rest of the world, that we can't wait until next year. We need to meet in January. We need to fix up these protocols, because the vast majority of things that are preventing us from dealing with this issue is this. It's a pen, a change in policy. And so it's very frustrating on our part when the science is there to back up what we're saying. The reality is on the ground for us to see what is happening, and that people are refusing to take their pen out of their pocket and to make the changes. And that's what we're asking for.
Let me just add one couple points. And the recent destruction that the region went through, at the CARICOM level, we visited all the countries as chairman of CARICOM with the Secretary General and others, the RSS team and CDMO. One thing struck me was, while there were enormous destruction in all the areas we went, there were few buildings among all the destruction that stood up. What came to mind was one thing from the information provided was the building code. That was evident then in those areas. There's a couple buildings withstood the destruction. It means, therefore, we got to concentrate seriously on a regional building code. And that's where our technical people must come in, because I think this is going to be a crucial part. And we got to prepare. I mean, from all the evidence, it's clear it's not if, it's when. So we got to do our part while we're doing all the other stuff to prevent the further increases in the temperature rises. Recently also, the Caribbean Tourism Association met in Grenada, and they were looking at some action plan that the region must do with respect to the tourism product in the event that any country gets hit, so that we don't have to be running as if we didn't know something was coming. But there are things already in place that we are there to help each other to recover as quickly as possible. In other words, these are just some of the things I believe that we ought to do in preparation for some of the things that we know certainly will come. But I want to compliment Dr. Taylor and his team for the work that you did. I know some people do not believe in the science, and some people we expect to understand, because the science is all around us. But we know that the science is real, and therefore we got to prepare ourselves accordingly.
At this point in time, I once again like to thank the Prime Ministers for taking the time out of their busy schedule to be with us, and also to Dr. Warren Smith from the Caribbean Development Bank to be here, and also for his institution to have sponsored the research. So kindly give one final applause to them, and I will invite them to